Welcome to CISO Forum Canada 2020. We have distinguished panelists here today, specifically on a very new and bleeding edge capabilities within the security space, which is considered DevSecOps. How do I integrate security into a development process? How do I integrate security to handle incidences? We're going to explore what DevSecOps is not. Because we see a lot of areas that are somewhat immature. We've had some successes from our panelists, and I welcome all of them and thank them for joining today. Okay, let's, from my side, let's start off with some questions. I know it's very, top of mind when people are describing DevSecOps. We see a lot of items after incidences such as Equifax, where DevSecOps became their prime transformation item, right? It was the driver for them to restore confidence in the market, improve their NPS, reduce their risk. But we've also seen considerable amount of organizations that are getting it wrong. They see it as something like tools. I've implemented tools. I look at code. So based on the surveys, I'll touch on one thing that's very common right now. We just had all-day DevOps. It's actually today, tomorrow, that sort of thing. And they do a survey every year, and it was about security. Their security comment was, the more elite a organization became, the more people saw security as slow. And I want people to comment on this. How are we bringing security experts to the table when releasing code? Sandra, maybe you have a take on that.
Well, it's really developing an integrated process from an agile perspective. So it's looking at having the shared responsibility for security within the operations, development, infrastructure organization, and looking at it from a definition done perspective. So everything within the CI/CD pipeline, making sure you have the static dynamic, code analysis. It's also training, the developers, the operations people in how to implement security within their areas of expertise. So, if you take a pipeline, making sure that first you train the developers on secure coding principles. No, they're not going to be the security experts, but providing them with the tool sets, with the training, the awareness, the tool sets to make sure as they are committing their code, they are scanning that code, understanding what vulnerabilities are there, teaching them to minimize those vulnerabilities going forward, and going through that entire process. And by doing that, you can remediate the vulnerabilities before they actually get into production.
Awesome. So from your perspective, it's make sure the stakeholders know their shared responsibility.
Yes.
But I want to dig more into that because I kind of find we can go also the wrong way, where a shift left motion, there might be concerns there because at some point someone might say, Dev, you own security, go do PCI compliance. Andrew, what's your take on how you feel about where the market is going, where responsibilities are shifting towards the development team? I know Sandra's mentioned a balance, but what do you think about development handling security?
I think one of the key shifts is in the past, there's been a lot of security teams that dealt with security as a risk assessment near the latter stages of a project. And then now as we get into Agile and DevOps, there's desire to try and make those sort of holistic risk assessments more iterative in some cases. And I think that the shift that needs to be happening is to break up those individual tests and basically as soon as the artifact is available that needs to get some sort of security testing or security review, then those tests should happen, right? So as soon as you're running code, run your DAST, as soon as you have some sort of server or container in the environment, you would run your configuration scans. And then that information should be available. Ideally, those scans or tests are being run manually, which is very often possible, being run in an automated fashion rather than manually, so that the feedback can get to the development team or the DevOps team as soon as possible. And to me, that's the key. You would still have the security team kind of being the owner of those tools, bringing those tools to the dev teams, the DevOps teams, but the responsibility for making sure they run, the responsibility for remediating the findings would lie with the dev team or DevOps team with some governance from the security team on top of that, right? I think that's sort of the key shift.
Okay, so turn the security bailiwick into orchestrated automation so that the developers can use it and advance their own capabilities, but not directly own it.
And the one thing I would add though is there are a few things, and threat modeling is one where it has to involve some sort of human component, so it can't be done in a fully automated fashion. But still, those things can be broken up into iterations and performed when an artifact is done. So you do some sort of design of a small portion of an application, go ahead and run threat modeling or design review or whatever your process is on that small component, rather than waiting for the big monolithic application to be designed for some sort of fulsome security review, right?
So I think that goes into a tangent for Aniket. I kind of look at DevSecOps has very much ignored many of the incidents response, the intel that we collect within systems that are already delivered, or how we find where threats are, as you mentioned, threat modeling. Aniket, why do you think that's not advancing as fast as we're seeing secure coding?
Yeah, no, I think it's a great question. I mean, I think it kind of like goes back to the point Andrew and Sandra made earlier. I mean, I think it's really that holistic look, meaning making sure that you have different stakeholders involved at the right time. So a little bit about threat modeling, and which is kind of sometimes based on the experience we have seen out in the industry, is also a misunderstood concept. They think of threat modeling as conducting towards the end stage and, combing that with automated tools to be able to leverage the data, which in many cases does not get contextualized. So I guess let me take a step back real quick, what really threat modeling is. I mean, it's looking really at applications through the lens of an attacker, and then to really then find and highlight any weaknesses that could be potentially exploited. If you think from a threat actor's perspective, or any state-sponsored groups, for example, they are really doing their own threat modeling in a way at the same stage where a potential application development could be happening from an organization's perspective. So if a threat actor could do it, why not we have a similar mindset when we're actually developing the application? So if you think about the whole exploit development, we do exploit development from the point of security assessments, breaking the applications or testing the applications from a regression test perspective, and then apply the intelligence there. What the industry could easily shift towards is really, okay, while those applications are in the process of getting developed, you start to integrate heavily the intelligence component there. And when I say intelligence component, it's really, okay, what type of application, what the end product is going to be look like, what is the actual target industry this product is going to be leveraged. Then once you have that understanding of your own environment or the product that you're going to be launching or application you're going to be developing, then you map that with the tactics, techniques, and procedures from threat intelligence perspective. Okay, is this a crime syndicate type actor who is not going to be too much worried about zero-day exploits, or is this going to be something more on the lines of a state sponsored, because they are going to be actually spending time, money, and effort to be able to identify those vulnerabilities no matter what. So I think that's the biggest challenge today. I mean, if from a state sponsored perspective, I sponsor someone to be able to, okay, you have to find exploits in this particular application. The short answer to that question is yes. In a day or two or in a weeks, yep, they will come back with something. So the argument really here is, if they can do it, at the end of the day, it's humans. Why cannot we, on the perspective of secure development lifecycle, why cannot we do it? So I think that's where the intelligence really comes into play, mapping the actual industry, what type of application, any previous attacks, what kind of exploits they leveraged, and really integrating that process right from the scratch. And then to Sandra's point, if organizations have a dedicated threat intelligence team, they obviously are getting some data. Some of the challenges, what we have seen in the past, is really taking that data as intelligence. I mean, if it's a temperature 10 degrees Celsius today, it's just a number to me, unless and until you say, okay, this 10 degrees Celsius is really going to, okay, I need to go for a run outside today, but now given the weather is warm, I need to adjust my gear. I don't need to be wearing layers of clothing and things of that nature. I mean, a weird parallel, but really the data never gets contextualized into actually what you really need out of it.
Okay, so I'll take that a little further and say that everything that we create, well, then can be exploited by someone. And then if we're following DevSecOps principles, Randy, I'm coming to you now. If we know that velocity needs to be controlled in some respects, but at the same time, we know we can't make something completely protected. What do you look at gating? How do you see security? Do they need it anymore, or they should be focusing on more of, am I improving, am I degrading? Because with the threat modeling comments and everything we've covered, there's going to be vulnerabilities. The question becomes, when should a security team say speed up? When should a security team slow down, or should they gate? What's your comment?
I guess my comment at this point is, are the security team still needed or required? I think absolutely. I just think maybe it's a bit of a switch to the function that they've been, fulfilling into the future. From my perspective, we're really trying to drive the information that we can get out of these different threat assessments and things like that to drive best practices and standards, right? Utilizing those best practices and standards and turning them over into the applications that we're developing. So, yeah, I mean, that's probably where we've already got a lot on the table. So,
got it. So from your side, it's more of getting people to be more responsive to best practices, more responsive to the KPIs that you're collecting, and then making sure we don't just get stuck in, come to me first, have a meeting, and I say yes or no. It's more data-driven collection of risks, and then from there, some service indicators or risk indicators that say this is acceptable or this is not acceptable. But I'll come to a different come to a different item, which is more about if I get metrics that are bad, and it's because I started measuring. What's your take on that? So like, you didn't have measurements before. I'll jump to Sandra. You didn't have measurements before. You start your DevSecOps practice. You become more responsive to the development. You're teaching them. They're taking on practices, and you see a dumpster fire. What do you do with the dumpster fire when you've identified it?
So does the dumpster fire happen after things have been going up, or that's your starting point?
No, that's your starting point, is a dumpster fire, right?
Your dumpster style, the only place to go is actually up from there. So at least I always say you've got a stake in the ground now. You actually know where you are. And then it's really going back to the training, to educating the developers and using the tools. And if you're committing your code, you're then finding out where your vulnerabilities are, right? And then you can fix them as you are going through the process, not at the end, but as you are actually developing your entire, the whole life cycle of, and during your sprint. So the biggest thing that I see is that people reuse code, and so you actually have vulnerabilities going down, and then all of a sudden you have old vulnerabilities reintroduced. And and I hate to say this, but gamifying it, having teams actually gamify and go head to head to see who can minimize the have the least amount of high risk and critical vulnerabilities, actually showing that. It's all about people understanding the impact that they're actually making and the time that it takes for you to do it proactively versus reactively. And when you've included in your definition done, you want to remediate all of your high risk and criticals prior to going into production. If you set that benchmark and people understand that from the beginning, then they're going to strive to ensure that their code is as secure as possible during the development process. So if you're in the dumpster, the only place that you can go is up. So really, you have to run it for a while to see how it's actually working, whether people are actually taking heed and understanding where the vulnerabilities are. And are they being remediated? So, you've got the dumpster, you can start checking after a month, 2 months, you can see the metrics, and hopefully all of them, your vulnerabilities are going down. But then if you also start seeing any spikes in those vulnerabilities, then you're asking the questions. So why is that happening? Has somebody decided all of a sudden that security is not important? Have they forgotten about definition done? Did somebody reuse code? So, there's numerous ways to look at that.
I'll touch on gamify because I think that would be an interesting item. I've done it in the past, and I think it comes down to, I just wanted to weigh in here, it comes down to the body of the team and the priorities of the leadership. So in the respective gamify, we decided to take a Star Wars theme. Those that were doing a good job would be move along from, Luke Skywalker to Yoda, right? And then those who are degrading would move towards, Darth Vader style or Anakin as he goes bad. My problem with that was we didn't realize that the leadership wasn't focusing on security. Some BUs were entirely not saying security is not important. You don't need to do this. Just get the features out, ignore them. I'll do your battles when you go to the leadership. What happened was I had a board with Darth Vaders. And then they're like, guys, we really shouldn't be highlighting how bad we are. We need to end the gamification. From our perspective, we saw, let's focus on finding, as you said, the problems within the organization that are preventing the teams from doing the right things. And Andrew, have you had any similar experiences where you needed to get people aligned so that you could see progress happen when different stakeholders have different responsibilities?
Yeah, a couple of thoughts. So when you've got an organization with 100 applications or 1,000 applications, it's actually kind of beneficial because then you can do this reporting by LOB unit, assuming your activities cover a big enough set of applications that you have a lot of data available to you. If you don't, then you need to probably scale the program first to have the data available. You put together good measurements that are objective enough that you won't have a lot of argument over how you're measuring the data. And that's a bit of a tricky thing to do, but it's not that hard. And then to Sandra's point, I haven't used the term gamification in the past, but definitely trying to take the approach of taking the 4 major business units or 10 different development team leads and providing them data related to their particular applications and essentially comparing them against each other. And you're not saying it like that, but you're presenting the data to their boss of the 10 different teams, along with some measurements related to vulnerabilities per line of code, vulnerabilities per server in the infrastructure, et cetera. And it's right there in the data. Assuming that you're comparing apples to apples and finding a way to do that, you sort of just let the data tell the story to say, this group is doing well, this other group's not doing well. And without even saying that, it's presented in the data and you see action from those teams because A, they're competitive and want to do well, and B, in a list like that, no one wants to be on in the bottom group. I think
I'm
it is
surprised
important.
You had the courage there to share them out. When we done it, we isolated them. Only leadership could see it because it's brand damage, right? You look at it, you're like, that is a dumpster fire.
No, like to me, the goal is if you've got a structure of like development director, development VP, SVP for a group, you would report within that group and all the directors within the group see each other's numbers when you present it at the VP's tables. And that to me drives that competition, that desire to improve. But you better be ready to stand behind the data you're presenting, right? So you have to have a way to take an application with 2 million lines of code and compare with an application with 100,000 lines of code, because otherwise you're unfairly sort of calling out the application with 2 million lines of code unless you start to provide metrics that provide data per 1,000 lines of code or something like that. So you do need to be careful if you're going to present it that way to be able to compare environments or applications of different size, right?
Agreed. I would say you focus on are they improving or not rather than compared to someone else. But I'm going to switch gears a little bit and I'm going to say, let's say you have the dumpster fire. And I know this is not maybe the best analogy, but let's say you have something that's risk. That risk is then implemented, you accept it, goes to prod, it's exploited. Aniket, how do you respond to a business when you have all this data and in many respects, all of the applications are in a state of very far from compliance, which I would say is the general state as you're building out your DevSecOps capabilities. And as Andrew and Sandra have been mentioning, you're measuring things and you're trying to progress, but you're starting from a low number, or you're starting from a high vulnerability matrices. What do you do and how do you help organizations after what they've done? How do you prevent them from going backwards after they've been exploited through one of those vulnerabilities that they clearly could see? How do you prevent the organization from saying, stop, DevSecOps isn't working, we're being intruded, there's exploits, we have brand damage?
Yeah, well, another, I guess, interesting topic. Majority of the times when we are running into any incident response situations, the vulnerability at hand which got exploited was way further down the stage, post any DevSecOps lifecycle. So you are really talking about systems missing basic vulnerabilities or systems not being patched for months. And I think that kind of like highlights the gap from the operational perspective, more on the IT ops, but there is certainly a confusion around, okay, whose problem is that at the end of the day? So if there's an incident, yes, the security IR teams are being activated, but at the end of the day, the patch wasn't applied for 2 months, 3 months, 4 months. If you take a look at the NotPetya ransomware like 2-3 years ago, the actual patch was provided by Microsoft around March first week, and the attack actually happened sometime in June. And you had thousands of organizations, well, thousands is a high number, but numerous organizations across the globe which basically got impacted straight away. So I think, from our perspective, the organizations are not doing the basics right. Forget about incorporating any vulnerability identification at the DevSecOps lifecycle. So from the recommendation perspective, what we are saying is, evaluate your attack surface from an external view perspective. If I'm the threat actor, I'm targeting your organization, all I have is your external view, more or less like a black box, and then testing it from that perspective. So as we are doing the incidents and we tie back the whole intelligence to it and say, okay, this is what really happened here, but the whole post remediation and contamination efforts focus more on going back to the basics of making sure you have everything up to date, and then really going into the static sort of like code reviews. Okay, what different applications or legacy applications you may be running, on what systems they are running. It could be a case where the attacker got access to the actual underlying code because there were not sufficient measures. I think there are many pieces are usually in play by the time threat actor ultimately has access to what he or she really needs.
Aniket, I appreciate that. Randy, you're going to get the hot potato, because basically what Aniket is saying, even if we do DevSecOps well, in many respects, because we don't incorporate the teams very closely together, sometimes operational requirements impact our ability to remove exploits, such as I can't just throw patches into prod without testing them, but I also have to do the delivery of applications. So you get a push and pull. I'm going to go a little deeper into it and say, we have methods that are available to ops teams where you could do infrastructure as code and scan it before it's created, which would cover many of those respects. I also think we are doing too much of static environments, and static environments that never get destroyed, never really build resilience or can recover, or you're like, it will run forever. I actually had clients ask, how long does this machine run for? When do you bring it down? When do you do releases? They're like, it runs forever. And the context to that is then I need to have these very rigid update processes that are not within the velocity realm of DevSecOps. So to you, Randy, how do you help organizations that have a very rigid environment work within a high velocity development environment to prevent what Aniket is saying? Vulnerabilities that go into secure code will still be vulnerable. The reason being is the platform itself is the risk. It's not the code. So like DevSecOps spans them all, but how do you handle those challenges where you have potentially an advanced team like devs? In some respects, I've seen ops too advanced. How do you bridge them to prevent these risks from taking us down?
Okay, good question.
I told you it'd be a hot potato.
No, I really see it a lot from an accountability side of things, right? If everybody understands what their role and what they're playing, what their role is in the entire process. If they understand the specific threats and what the potential impact are of those threats, then there's a decision-making process that needs to be made, right? Whether we can slow people down or not, or whatnot. So, yeah, I'm a little stuck. But
Do you want to throw the hot potato?
Yeah, I'll chuck it.
You pick.
I'll provide a thought. I think one of the key ingredients here is the dependency of your systems, right? If you think about legacy applications where they were kind of a big monolithic application, and you really couldn't make a change to one piece over here without full regression testing of the entire application to understand all the impacts in other places, right? So you couldn't patch that web server without doing full testing of the entire application, for example. And then now there's a big shift with microservices and containerization and similar capabilities to the point where you can take that large application and break it down into dozens of components that are in effect independent. And you can patch this piece without worrying about the effect on this piece. A lot of companies and applications aren't there yet, but to me, in sort of the literature and the conversations, it seems like that's the direction we're going to try and resolve this issue of not being able to patch, because the reason why that patching is not happening in many cases is because we have to do this full regression test, and we have this new release coming, and we figure we'll just test it with that release or whatever, right? We need to break those dependencies.
I'm gonna throw fire in, as I want the potato to get hotter. My thought would be, and I want to add to it, is, do you believe, and Sandra, I think you can grab this, do you then believe that we are ignoring or focusing more on greenfield applications rather than the legacy and monoliths? Like from my context, you can do DevOps or DevSecOps with monoliths and AS400s. You could do it with Pegasystems. I'm gonna throw the potato now your way. How do we get them involved so that they actually have? It's never going to go away. Legacy will always exist. We'll always have things we did first and did last. So some things will be worse than others. How do you fix the perspective that DevSecOps is really a modern code requirement, meaning you need greenfield?
Well, it's the speed that allows people to actually do the work. So, but it also requires new skill sets. And oh, sorry, I've got a fire truck going by. It also requires new skill sets. So there's your dumpster fire. I just saw it go by. But it requires new skill sets. So if you look at the whole SecDevOps or DevSecOps environment, you need people who understand code. You need people who understand infrastructure. You need people who understand security. And it's a whole blend. And that skill set isn't as easy to understand. Plus there's all the legacy. We're still going to have legacy. We're going to continue. And you can put those pipelines in, whether it's an AS400 or whether it's, new technology, old technology. But really, a lot of people are still focusing on new technology and with cloud applications, and they still have the mentality of old architectures. And they're designing in that way. They're not utilizing the containers, the microservices. They still have the mentality of servers. And so the whole thing is to create standardized containers. And so, one of my old colleagues used to say is instead of creating pets, you create cattle. And so you create containers that can be rebuilt, torn down very quickly. And that way, throughout the entire process, you've integrated that security ownership in the operational aspect of it. So you kind of make sure that from an ops perspective, the containers have a minimum level of security, minimum level of requirements, and people can basically pick off a list to say, I need this, 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 and this, and there you go. And then as you continue, as new vulnerabilities happen, you rebuild the containers, you redeploy things. And it's not the arduous task of having to, go through all the regression testing, go through everything.
I'm going to make it a little hotter now, and it's going to come to Aniket. If we do follow the model of let's do immutable infrastructure, things that are bad, destroy, learn how to handle chaos. I'm going to go to Aniket and say, how do you then, for things that you don't know you need to collect from a forensics perspective, in DevSecOps, the mentality is all about managing chaos, destroy and self-heal, new containers come up, but you also lose the footprint of that machine. So if you go down all the way to the right, let's say, where everything's immutable, nothing needs to stay. Let's say you have incidences occurring, but you're not collecting particular fingerprints that you need, and these things are destroyed. How are you managing that risk now that things aren't there forever for you to go and grab data from? We are going down the path of whatever it is you're going on is gone. What's your take on that from the forensic side after an incident actually occurs and they want it to be destroyed and we're doing it for them and they're using that as a method to get hidden?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think the prevalence of anti-forensics techniques is very common. We are in a realm of ransomware. We are now seeing threat actors leveraging, deploying their own virtual machines in an environment and launching the entire attack from there. Once they are done, they basically delete those virtual machine files, so you really don't have any evidence of what just happened here. I mean, I guess evidence directly from the system. So to your question, from an investigation perspective, it's really piecing together these different breadcrumbs. So not one system itself is not going to give us enough what we need. It's really a combination of, when did they come in? Do you have access logs? And whether the organizations were maintaining following the right log retention policies for us to be able to then capture and see if we are seeing any signs of suspicious activity there. And then kind of going back to the actual application or the system level logging, and whether are they logging enough or are they logging too much. I mean, based on our experience, they log too much, but really miss the actual critical fields that we really need for the purposes of our investigation. So to your question, I mean, there have been, I would say, 7 out of 10 instances where there's not enough information available, but we then kind of like combine the overall the incident timeline in terms of what happened, how did they come in, which systems they accessed, what new user accounts they created. So for us, it's the entire enterprise and not so much really about the actual application. In the other piece really to think about is, they are going after the actual like crown jewels. So when a threat actor has, for example, successfully infiltrated, they are moving from A to B or moving laterally from here to there to ultimately run their own scans somehow, which then goes undetected by any tools that you may be running. And then once they find that vulnerable application, it may or may not be the custom application developed by the organization. It could again be something that the organization was leveraging a third-party application. So once you have that initial foothold and then you find the actual exploit, then that's really what it matters. And then even if you don't have any evidence available, it's really the way we pull it is through the log examination or any process level artifacts. Again, sometimes it's too late, but it's kind of like goes back to piecing together different breadcrumbs.
So I think it comes down then to time. You're saying for people that are doing this in an immutable world, it's seconds that matter. So I'll go down that path. If seconds matter, then it's really important to find out if our DevSecOps model includes security fitness, i.e., do I have things set up to respond within X seconds? And then I come back to Randy's comment about accountability. I'll ask the question, within the idea of accountability, how do you get organizations to measure their setup and their tooling?
Did I lose Shlomo here?
Capabilities and how those tools are used to meet requirements. Am I back?
Yeah, you're back.
Am I back?
Yeah.
Hello? Okay. I don't know where I dropped off there, but it said my internet connection was unstable, which you got to get used to at home. I come to Randy and say, when you have accountability and they have services that they provide, how do you get them to measure the fitness to make sure you're not in these scenarios that 5 hours pass and they made machines, destroyed machines, and you didn't even capture it? How do you get those accountable to measure the fitness of their services so that you can manage the velocity that's coming? Because the faster the velocity gets, the more risks you put into the environment because you iterate so quickly, and it also destroys so quickly. How do you get those that are accountable to start measuring what they have available is actually going to meet the business requirements or the risk management requirements?
I think a lot of it has to do with the metrics and the metrics that we can see coming out of that, right? To assess the risk. I mean, I know how we're driving it within my organization. Metrics are a key, really a key piece to the decision-making process and how we can assess that. So it's a huge piece.
So yours would be, if I can measure security fitness based on the KPIs, either of threats or vulnerabilities or whatever metrics I'm collecting, and use that as, this is either sufficient or not sufficient.
It's a decision point for sure. Absolutely.
Any
comments on it, Andrew? I see you contemplating.
No, I was just thinking about, Randy keeps getting the hard questions, so it is hard, right? That was my initial thought when you're asking the question. I was like, it is hard. That was the thought in my head, because you've got these different components being delivered, whether it's new VMs in the infrastructure or containers, and the question is, how do you make sure that as they're deployed, if they're being stood up and stood down in a short period of time, that they meet all of the security properties you're looking for, right? Including logging and monitoring, centralized logging, or whatever you would need to do these investigations. Like, I assume for forensics, I actually don't know, because I haven't, worked in an environment that has a lot of these sort of transient instances of servers, but I assume you're not going to keep copies of them around for a long period of time. The whole point is to not have the copies and to be able to stand them up and stand them down. So I assume the solution here is to have things like centralized monitoring or centralized logging, where when you stand them up, they're immediately, as soon as they're live, feeding their logs to a centralized log management service, such that when they no longer exist, we've actually got the log data we need available in a centralized service. I think that that's sort of the solution.
So you're suggesting that would be part of the image then, to make sure that the security fitness is part of the image in the future state. So when it comes up, even if it's for 5 seconds, because to be honest with you, I've done a hack fest. If you give an actor more than a minute, he's probably got full control of all your nodes in the entire data center. If he had a place he could do remote shell, or remote code execution. You're suggesting then, now, instead of having security as a principle within the security organization, it becomes part of the code release, that the logging component is a factor of readiness. So that when it comes up, even if it's up for 30 seconds, it will then go to the log aggregator. Log aggregator can set off an alert, call the right person and say, you actually have incidences that are popping up and disappearing. You're compromised.
Correct. But I extended to other security properties too, right? Like logging, that concept of feeding to the centralized log management service is one, but there's probably a healthy list of security properties, including enrolling that IP, if it's an IP, into a centralized vulnerability management sort of scanning service, properties related to the configuration of that instance itself. So there's a collection of properties, and the key point is to try and make sure that those things happen as it's being built. And if you have things where you're sort of like, oh, once we have a new instance, we're going to enroll it in the log management service within 30 days, then that's not going to work, right? It's got to be built into, if you have infrastructure as code or automation for building these things, you've got to build all those security properties into that. And I just don't think that's very easy, right? It's not an easy problem to solve.
Maybe we miss it too. So like, I'll go back to Randy here. If we do miss things, and it's going to happen, right? Because these vulnerabilities are exploited by external entities. And as Aniket said, we need to take it from the context of outside. Randy, within your space and all that you're doing within your organization, how do you leverage external bodies to get you that visibility of your risk?
So we have engagements with third parties that will come in and help do those vulnerability assessments for us. And then, once the information comes back, we can then make the decision on the risk of moving forward and without addressing the vulnerability or not, right?
So external parties, I kind of find, do help provide the red team model, where they may attack your staging system to find out those vulnerabilities. I think one of the hardest parts is then to take their findings and change how the pipelines run so that the vulnerabilities are remediated on the next release. Sandra, how have you done that at your organization, where let's say you find X is really bad? How do you get that security finding that may be outside of the SDLC, it's from external providers? How do you get the team then to adopt a method where they say, okay, I'm prioritizing your finding that's totally outside of our release notes or release candidate, but I take your concern and your priority into consideration? How do you get that to happen?
Well, and the way I've done that, and before and do it now, is make sure that anything that comes to light has a time period that it needs to be remediated in. So it's part of your standard process to say, all high risk critical vulnerabilities have to be, have to be fixed prior to implementation. If you have medium risk, it has to be fixed, within 60 days. Low risk, you evaluate. If it's something third party, then again, you have to work with them to understand what contract you signed and what aspects they will actually remediate.
I'm going to give you a hot potato now, because you stated we have time frames for fixing findings. Yep. I'm going to give you, I'm not going to say who, but let's say it's a top bank. I'm not going to say which country. And they say, I have 100,000 vulnerabilities, high vulnerabilities in production today. What do you do within that circumstance? Like, we have time frames, but you also have realities of, because findings are new, or they may be old, you might not just get to it. You might have to have the developers. How do you handle a really wide vulnerability base that are gating or want to gate? It won't work.
So I think you really need to understand where the vulnerability is. Like, you can minimize the risk of vulnerabilities. You're never going to get rid of all of the vulnerabilities in an environment. So
that's key.
You won't get there. But how can you actually minimize the risk? What are the compensating controls in place? I've seen systems where they have zero input validation, but they have an application firewall in front of it. You take that firewall down, and within 5 minutes, it's going to be breached. So you're not going to remediate those vulnerabilities. So what you've done is you've minimized the risk by putting something in front of it. So again, it's it's understanding what the impact is going to be, because if it's going to be a huge impact to the organization, it's going to take down your digital properties, then you really have to assess how quickly you're going to remediate. And if you are going to leave it there, how quickly can you actually recover from it, and what's your exposure going to be? So understanding that. And then if it's buried within your environment, because everybody has some, server sitting in the corner that's been there for 10 years that you're still relying on something on it, making sure that there's the multi-layer approach to security to make sure it's buried as far into your infrastructure as possible, that you can't get to it. Or it takes a lot more work to get to it.
I'm going to ask a question. It's going to go to Aniket, because I think it's a harder question for someone within the Intel and cybersecurity space. I have to ask it because it's a challenge. Would you agree with the statement, I don't need you to fully comply, I just need you to improve? Would you accept that statement within the context of risk? You know why I ask you, because because that's what we're stating. We're stating deltas are key, and work towards improvement. So the target is delta and improvement, not entirely compliant. So would you accept that as a DevSecOps, core mantra or core mentality?
I
for
guess
the
it,
security?
I'll say it depends. I think that's the safest answer ever. I mean, I think in terms of reducing your attack surface, right? I mean, I think that's all pretty much we are talking about in from an external threat perspective. It's really about being on the right journey to be able to reduce the risk. And again, it's a process. So I think to your previous question, so for example, if an organization has 100,000 vulnerabilities, I mean, I think something is broken somewhere. I mean, you don't have that many amount of vulnerabilities just pop up one fine day. You are slowly accumulating those. But if you also have a proactive risk reduction program, so you are continuously going after your testing the applications, and making sure you are either segregating them somehow to like a layered defense mechanism. I think as Sandra mentioned, if you have a legacy system, but you put compensating controls in front of it, so you are at least micro segmenting or segmenting it from the wider attack surface. So to your point, it's a continuous journey really. And a point Andrew mentioned earlier in terms of like identifying those vulnerabilities. Any new system pops up, like how do you make sure they are continuously under the surveillance of security operations? So it's also about having tools in your environment which answer the basic question of, do you know how many systems or applications or servers or assets are present in your environment today? In my experience, from an incident response perspective, whenever we ask that question post incident, we have never been able to get the exact count of systems. We hear, oh, they are in the range of 10,000, they are in the range of 15,000, but the actual count is typically 8 to 10% more. So really, I think it's all about getting systems, in direct surveillance, visibility. Once you have visibility, then you can implement those detection programs. You can have visibility on what vulnerabilities are possibly present on them. Tie that back with, okay, are these vulnerabilities actively being exploited? Another confusion we see again from industry's perspective is, high, medium, low risk scoring. So if you go back to the whole CVSS scoring system, the way the vulnerability is categorized as low is because it hasn't been exploited to date.
Agreed. Yeah.
Any high
it can
is,
change.
yes, it has been exploited, so the risk goes up. So there's obviously a risk versus compliance battle. From a compliance perspective, yes, we have check marked all the high and the mediums, but the lows never get attention unless they get exploited, or unless you have your intelligence or someone within your security telling you guys, we need to treat all high, medium, and lows as same priority the way you are treating the highs. And that's from our perspective is the fundamental challenge the industry is facing today. Either you blame the product or blame the vendors. I mean, I think that's really how things are being perceived.
So I would summarize that as there's a layered approach, which also goes to the next question. Scan, which is where tools come in. Get a understanding of all the risks that are there, right, and all the assets. Then reduce, i.e., compensating controls. If I do find risks, it's not, I can't just accept them. If I can put compensating controls to reduce the threat vectors, then I'm going to do it because it's smart, it's easy, it's effective. And then set an improvement target. So DevSecOps is all about setting improvement targets. Yes, I put compensating controls in. Yes, I scan to find out. I may have used external, but I also want to get down to the last, in my mind, one of the last questions, which is a lot of teams get very tied to the first step, which is the scan, that tools are the target. And if I have tools keep me safe. I'm not going to pick anybody to answer here because it's a energized question and it's spun with a bias a little bit there. How do you keep organizations from thinking tools keep you safe? How do you keep them from thinking DevSecOps as tools? How do you handle that? How do you layer on the other components that we just talked about, the setting improvement targets and reducing the risk with other methods?
I'll take an attempt. In the context of tools that are used for for testing or identifying vulnerabilities. So this is your source code analysis, dynamic analysis tools, vulnerability scanning tools for containers, for example. I think it's key to remember what the purpose of those tools are, right? If you're identifying vulnerabilities and you're not fixing them, then the whole exercise is pretty much pointless, right? So I've experienced that in running AppSec programs in the past, where we get pretty focused on rolling out that SAST or DAST tool, and we spend a year trying to get the filters right, get it deployed to multiple applications, and we sort of forget a little bit about the job of actually fixing the vulnerabilities that are identified. So that's key, is to actually fix the bugs and other vulnerabilities that are identified. And I think that's often forgotten, or maybe not given them enough emphasis. You might be putting only 20% of your energy there and 80% of the energy into these tools because they're a little bit fancier and cooler. And then the second piece to take that sort of job to be done a little bit further is, the way I'm thinking about it now is trying to figure out, trying to focus a little more energy on actually preventing those bugs from being introduced in the future, right? So, if you've gotten to the point where you have a healthy process of finding and fixing the bugs or the vulnerabilities, then your next evolution is to try to find ways to use certain frameworks or certain design patterns to try to avoid those vulnerabilities from even existing in the first place. So you don't have to find it and fix it, you can avoid it. And I think there's a habit in a lot of development teams, especially, to use development frameworks that are 3 or 4 or 5 years old, when if they were using the most modern development framework, there's a lot of security functions built in that they could leverage and avoid vulnerabilities from the start, right? So those, I think, are the keys. So the tools are helpful, but I think don't forget about that key, the ultimate job to be done, right?
So I'll break it into two categories then. Tools are great from an integration perspective to get the landscape. Output, and compare your previous to current state so that you can see that the output has improved is key in DevSecOps. There's tools out there such as like TFSec, which is basically take infrastructure as code and scan it before you create it, which is an entirely new security area, which is you could get someone who takes advantage of TFSec's rules and then allow people to create vulnerable things so you can exploit them. So there's all types of new vectors that I think are coming in within the context of creating infrastructure, protecting infrastructure, and because we're moving everything to code, we need to focus very much so, not so much on the tools itself, but what the tools tell us, and that we're actually fixing what the tools tell us. I kind of find that's the biggest gap, which is the only way you're going to get the fire out in that dumpster is if you actually start throwing water on what's making the fire, right? So think of the tools as telling you how big the fire is, and output is telling you how many cups of water you need to throw on it, unless it's oil. If it's oil, do not throw water on it.
Yeah.
I at this point, I think as we close out, I just like to thank everybody for participating. It was enjoyable. I had a lot of fun, and hopefully everybody enjoyed the somewhat warm potatoes we threw around.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you, Shlomo.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Okay.